All right, welcome to the second. All right. So, welcome to the second session of the Northwest, or I guess it's technically the third session now, of the Northwest Socialist Conference, Marxism and Women's Oppression. And I think this is an extremely pertinent discussion today. You can't go anywhere without seeing sexism and women's oppression everywhere. You can't open up a magazine without seeing women being exploited to sell products. We see the continued restriction to abortion clinics and defunding of Planned Parenthood. Women still earn much lower pay, 72 cents to the dollar, I think it is right now, 70? Okay. And welfare was gutted back in the 90s, and there's many single parents that have to continue to scrape by on their daily lives while trying to raise children and pay rent as well. And I think it's actually really important for the Portland State campus as well, as we've seen sort of a spike in sexual assaults over the last couple of years, and how we actually approach that, because the administration wants to actually bring a police force onto campus to take care of that. And I think we do want to take an active role in ending sexual violence against women on campus, but I think militarizing the campus isn't actually the solution. And I think maybe we can talk about that even in this meeting if you want to, or even after that, because I think that there's much better ways of actually making this campus a safe place for women than bringing police over here with guns. So I'd like to, without me talking anymore, I'd like to introduce Elizabeth Schulte. She is a journalist for Socialist Worker newspaper and a regular, this is the paper right here, she has an article in it, which is great, and the International Socialist Review, and she'll be talking about Marxism and women's liberation.
I'm going to start this talk where it should start, which is with a rant about the state of women. Yeah, and I'm just starting to say, it should be obvious to anyone in this room, women are indeed oppressed, no matter what they tell you out on the street. In the weirdo world where during the elections there's like a week, like all year long, women are doing fine. It's a post, inequality era, whatever. One week during the election, women's issues are really important. Romney loves women. There's women all over the convention at the RNC, Republican National. Anyway, in that weird world, we have Indiana senators saying rape is a miracle for women, and I mean, it should be no surprise. And just go through some of the concrete examples of how women have a second class status in society. All around us. Women in the U.S. are paid on average 77 cents for every dollar a man makes, a number that has changed very little in the last 50 years. Only about a cent a year on average. According to the Institute for Women's Policy Research, if it keeps up at the same rate, we will have to wait a very long time before we reach parity with men. In fact, we'd have to wait till the year 2056. I don't know about you, I'm probably not going to be around for that. We're subjected to discrimination and harassment on the job on a regular basis. Women are more likely to go without health insurance. Obviously, our reproductive rights are under attack. A fundamental right for abortion to be able to control what we do with our own bodies is under question. Guttmacher Institute, who tracks studies on reproductive rights, was saying there were like 30 restrictions passed this last year attacking women's right to choose. The year before was 90-some. And this is during supposedly the good times when we have a Democrat in office. And just to say that and put that out there, that this is what's going on. And then the repercussions for women just living in a world that is so steeped in inequality and in sexism. Socialist Worker, one of the writers of Socialist Worker this week wrote an article about young women who are, one young woman who's being charged as an adult for giving birth to her baby and throwing it in the garbage because she didn't know how to talk to her parents about it. Also, women who, a young woman who commits suicide because she was being bullied and harassed after it was found out that she had been videotaped having sex with someone. It's just like this, kind of an avalanche of attacks and things that are felt personally and also, but are also, I would argue, are systematic. Socialists fight against sexism see the fight for sexism and the liberation of women as central to the fight for socialism. Socialists do not minimize the evidence of women's oppression in society. Rather, we are often the first to identify it and the first to combat it. And in contradiction to ideas that argue that the world has always been this way, or that socialists actually locate the source of women's oppression not in the natural human traits, but in class society itself. So while some people on the right, and even sometimes people on the left, may use the idea of argue that men and women have traits that are natural, that to them men are warriors or women are nurturing, socialists see the root of oppression and actually in capitalism itself. And what's important about that is that when we can actually locate the source of women's oppression, we can also envision a possibility that exists for a completely different society where women are equal. Karl Marx, along with his collaborator Friedrich Engels, linked the oppression of women with the rise of class society. And people should get Engels' a book, The Origins of the Family, Private Property, and the State, and read through it. It's an important book. They used anthropological research available at the time by Lewis Morgan, and he offered a materialist explanation of a long period of private communism, which actually preceded class society. The research helped Engels to clarify how women's oppression rose hand in hand with the rise of class society. He looked at the Iroquois people, Morgan did, and he showed a couple of things. He said that there was actually a division of labor between men and women before class society, but it also showed that at that time women also had complete autonomy over their responsibilities, and they had decision-making power over society as a large. A sexual division of labor was present in pre-class societies, but it didn't translate into inequality for women until the change in the mode of production, going from a hunter-gatherer society to more agricultural production. Previously, women were able to sort of combine their reproductive and productive roles. Like they could take, go gathering, take the kid along. But with the rise of class society, productive and reproductive spheres began to separate and became strictly separated, and inequality began to give way. Over time, women became trapped in their individual families as the reproducers of society, cut off from production. And with the rise of a surplus, private property began to be concentrated into a very few hands. Usually the men who had control of the other sphere, the domestication of animals and all of that, and into men's hands by the nature of the area that they operated in. Anthropologist Karen Sachs put it this way: private property transformed the relations between men and women within the household only because it also radically changed the political and economic relations in larger society. For Engels, the new wealth in domesticated animals meant that there was a surplus of goods available to exchange between productive units. With time, production by men specifically for exchange purposes developed, expanded, and came to overshadow the household's production for use. As production of exchange eclipsed production for use, it changed the nature of the household, the significance of women's work within it, and consequently, women's position in society. So they're very clear. Engels is very clear in The Origins of Family, Private Property, and State. Marriage is essentially a property relationship. And with the onset of class society, it came to shift towards the role of men as the head of the household. Now, of course, Engels is writing 1884, so of course many of the ideas aren't perfect, and he is, influenced by Victorian ideas of the time. He, contradictions in that he has a scathing criticism of monogamy, but he also sort of envisions a future society, a love society where there's true love and monogamy in the future. We might change on that. We can't really say what kind of society, what kind of relationships people would have. Marx evidently was more open to these ideas. Of just recently, research into his ethnological notebooks revealed that he had more to develop on that. There's a book which, if anyone's thinking about a Christmas present for me, He can spend like $136 on a frickin' book. Anyway, I will borrow it later. I was actually able to find a way to rent it for 72 hours. But anyway, Heather Brown, who's a Marxist feminist, is actually looking at Marx's writing in the ethnological notebooks and actually seeing, you know, where he was more developing upon Engels' ideas at the time. It's really, really looks very good. Engels also didn't have a picture of the working class family that was a bit romanticized about what would be possible for women's equality. That didn't end up matching reality. He didn't foresee the fact that women would be forced to take on a double burden both at home and at work. He thought that once she was in the workplace, it would have a more freeing effect on it. And of course, as we know, the reality for working class women is a double burden of work and family at the same time. The situation in which women work outside the home and inside the home benefits capitalism immensely, as women are largely still responsible for reproduction and socialization of a new generation of workers. In this way, capitalism has privatized myriad necessary day-to-day tasks and doesn't have to pay a penny for it. And even though there's though much of the data has been improved over the decades, Engels provided a materialist explanation of the oppression of women, showing that the unequal relationships where women were subjugated to men don't exist before class society. And the fact that he and Marx were able to imagine a future with different social relationships where they questioned marriage and all of that, and that it wasn't stamped forever, that the idea of the family is really, I think, an important development. It can't be underestimated, and how groundbreaking it was for its time, and actually for even today in a lot of situations. And then the family's role reduces women's role to second-class citizen in the family is key to understanding questions about greater inequality and sexism in society at large. And it has repercussions beyond the family itself. It means lower wages, it means poverty, it means less access to health care, and women treated as second-class citizens and sex objects as well, and the double standards around that. For Engels, the answer to solving this inequality was providing the conditions where true equality could exist. So, for instance, you know, he wrote this: the necessity of creating real social equality between women and men will only be seen in the clear light of day when both possess legally complete equality of rights. Then it will be plain that the first condition for the liberation of the wife is to bring the whole female sex back into public industry, and that this in turn demands that the characteristic of the monogamous family as the economic unit of society be abolished. So when we have a complete and total transformation in which all of these tasks performed privately can actually become a public concern, then you can see equality of women. And just to say, critics of Engels and Marx who might say that they reduce everything to class relations, or that they privilege class struggle over the fight for women's liberation. A reading of Engels and Marx actually shows otherwise, I would argue. Marxism locating the source of women's liberation, class society, so that we can actually end it. And he actually, I think, had a good understanding and observation about the oppression of women's everyday lives in terms of rape, domestic abuse, etc. When you read through Origins, or also the conditions of the working class in England, also provides examples of what women workers, the terrible conditions that women workers in England faced in the factories, and their children, and the ramifications for that. And I think it's important to understand that contribution that they make. This is part of the real Marxist tradition about confronting oppression and recognizing every step of the way, and was built upon by future socialists. For socialists, the fight for women's liberation is the concern of all workers, of men and women, and a united fight against sexism and women's oppression is necessary if it's going to win. Lenin argued, the Russian Revolutionary Lenin argued that socialists had to be the tribune of the oppressed. And I'll just read the full quote where he talks about that. Sorry, new glasses. I'm a little, that's why, yeah. Anyway, working class consciousness cannot be genuine political consciousness unless the workers are trained to respond to all cases of tyranny, oppression, violence, and abuse, no matter what class is affected. A revolutionary must be a tribune of the people who is able to react to every manifestation of tyranny and oppression, no matter where it appears, no matter what stratum or class of people it affects. So, for instance, important movements like the women's liberation movement of the 1960s, which didn't identify itself as a purely working class women's movement, but also, took up had many middle class women who took part in it, played a huge role in transforming attitudes about women at large. And I would argue that socialists where socialists should be in fighting against oppression in that movement. Marxists understand that capitalism relies on oppression to sustain itself and also affects oppressed groups beyond the working class. The working class, however, is the force in society that is the most effective at combating it. Because of the working class's common interest in uniting, it makes working class men and women actually the best equipped to fight for true liberation. Capitalism, however, sustains itself in part by sowing divisions among the working class along lines of gender, race, and sexual preference. As Frederick Douglass, the black abolitionist, said, they divided each to conquer both. Sexism is not a mistake, but it's necessary for capitalism to survive. It thrives upon it, thrives upon convincing men that they have something to gain from the second-class status of women. It lowers, by lowering women's wages, it means that all workers, including men's living standards, are lowered, and it makes it harder for us to unite and fight our real common enemy. So the job of socialists is opposing sexism and attacks of women, and to argue if we need be. And it's worth also saying that sexism can come from women as well as men. Women are as influenced by sexist ideology that permeates capitalist society, and I think that's fair to point out. Marx argued that struggle was the key to transforming these ideas. Conditions in everyday life force workers to confront these backward and harmful ideas of capitalism, but it's not always obvious that the dominant ideas are wrong. And that's what Marx would call the ruling ideas of society. Revolutionaries have to confront the ideas. And in times of upheaval, when workers are engaged in collective working class struggle, these ideas come into question. The contradictions become uncovered for everyone to see. And workers challenge the old ideas. What time?
Oh, you have about 26 minutes.
Oh, okay, I didn't know. Cool. In order to succeed, they force to challenge the ideas about one another so that they can unite. They come to see who their allies are and who their real enemy is. Alexander Kollontai was the leader of the 1917 Russian Revolution and the Bolshevik Party, described the relationship between struggle and men and women workers sharing a common interest in overthrowing capitalism. In 1909, she wrote this in the social basis of the women's question. She had this to say: "The women and her male comrades are enslaved by the same conditions. The same hated chains of capitalism oppress their will and deprive them of the joys and charms of life. It is true that several specific aspects of the contemporary system lie with double weight upon women. It is also true that the conditions of hired labor sometimes turn working women into competitors and rivals to men. But in these unfavorable situations, the working class knows who is guilty. The woman worker, no less than her brother in misfortune, hates that insatiable monster with its glided maw, which, concerned only to drain all the sap from its victims and to grow at the expense of millions of lives, throws itself with equal greed at man, woman, and child. Thousands of threads bring the working man close." She was not one to mince words. Ultimately, the fight is for a completely different society. And what we have to look to, is instances in history when actually there has been workers' power and we have seen greater liberation. I think a lot of people probably went to Leela's great talk in the last session, so we've heard some of this, but I think it's really important to look at examples of what the Russian revolutionaries did to actually fight for women's liberation. It was clear that material conditions for must actually exist for liberation, for equality really to flourish. And they addressed and integrated oppression to fight for a different society. The Russian revolutionary Lenin put a premium on recognizing the oppression faced by women, working class women and peasant women in the home, and focused on the changes that could transform material conditions for women. That is, that you can't simply decree women's liberation, but you actually have to find material conditions for emancipation to be necessary. I'll just put a little quote here. Okay, cool. Might be early. And this is Lenin. And he developed, adding on to Engels, where he left off in terms of the double burden that women faced. The female half of the human race is doubly oppressed under capitalism. The working women and the peasant women are oppressed by capital. But over and above that, even the most democratic of bourgeois republics, they remain, firstly, deprived of some rights because the law does not give them equality with men. And secondly, and this is the main thing, they remain in household bondage. They continue to be household slaves, for they are overburdened with the drudgery of the most squalid and backbreaking and stultifying toil in the kitchen and the individual family household. He concludes, the real emancipation of women, real communism will begin only where and when an all-out struggle begins, led by the proletarian wielding a state power against the petty housekeeping, or rather with this wholesale transformation into large-scale socialist economy begins. The workers' government, which must make concrete changes to make emancipation possible, and they did during the Russian Revolution. There were decrees that were necessary that made things possible right away, like they instituted de facto or voluntary marriage. Rules pertaining to divorce were changed, so the couple wanted to separate, they just were separated because, and they could do so immediately. Abortion was legalized, and a study of contraception was initiated to find out more about that because that was so important. Priority was placed on the health and safety of pregnant women and the care of their children. On the job, women workers could expect a shortened workday to 8 hours, which tells you a little bit about the times. Right? It would be nice actually to have that today, back today. Better safety conditions on the job, paid maternity leaves of 8 weeks before and 8 to 12 weeks after she gave birth. Although there's different figures on that, but that's amazing. She and Kollontai also envisioned relationships between men and women based on the desire to be with one another, not on economic necessity, which is the basis of most of marriage. Kollontai wrote some interesting things, some sort of wild things about how she envisioned love relationships in the future and families in the future. And you might disagree or agree with some of them, but at least there was the space to actually envision a world where you could choose the kind of relationships that you have. And she said, the separation of the kitchen from marriage is a great reform, no less important than the separation of church and state. And they made those measures to make that possible. And then concretely to have things like communal maternity homes, to have nurseries, to have communal laundries and mending centers. It meant that you had the things were collectivized that were once just the province of your family itself. And it also means that women had the time to take part in politics and to discuss and debate and be part of the ideas of how to run the new society, that they were freed from these household chores. And just to, I think that this is a vision and something that's definitely worth, that we have to keep in mind when we're fighting. And just to say something, over the decades, particularly in academia, it's been kind of fashionable to sort of criticize Marxism, and sometimes even by people who haven't read Marx, just kind of say that it reduces everything to class and economic concerns, and doesn't take seriously oppression of women. And I think that there's some writing out there from Marxist feminists that actually would tell you otherwise and have something else to say. I've been recently reading Martha Jimenez and Lise Vogel more, and reading their contribution to this debate. And I just think I'll put a quote in here from Jimenez, and when she comes back on people who kind of accuse Marxists of being reductionist. She said this in 2005. The notion that under capitalism the mode of production determines the mode of reproduction, and consequently observable unequal relations between men and women, is not a form of economism or class reductionism, but the recognition of the complex network of macro-level effects upon male-female relationships of a mode of production driven by capitalist accumulation, rather than the goal of satisfying people's needs. To argue otherwise, postulating that the mutual interaction between the organization of production and the organization of reproduction, or giving causal primacy to the latter, is to overlook the theoretical significance of the overwhelming evidence documenting the capitalist subordination of reproduction. And she said, in contradiction, pointed to some of the contradictions that were of class divisions among women themselves was actually something that could not be ignored, and said the use of paid domestic labor, domestic workers, not only by capitalist women, but by women affluent enough to afford them, highlights how oppression is not something that only man can inflict upon women. She adds, the real advances of upper middle class professional and business women, those earning six-figure salaries, have made in the last 30 years, presupposes the existence of a servant stratum drawn from the less skilled layers of the working class, including a large proportion of women from racial and ethnic minorities, often undocumented immigrants. I think that it's important to say that I feel like in many ways, since the recent movements against the 1% and against corporate greed, that I feel like Marx is back in a way, and is more relevant than it ever has. And I feel like it's also more relevant in terms of okay, I'm almost done. Relevant in terms of looking at women's liberation as well. And these Marxists that Marxist feminists that actually also show that Marx is a living and breathing philosophy that explains the world and can be developed and added onto. And in so many ways, as we are trying to look at the world and explain it, we can also develop and understand the changes in the world. And just to end with this sort of social, what I'd say is like a socialist attitude towards women's liberation and socialism. Without women's liberation, there can be no socialism, and without socialism, there cannot be women's liberation. It's key that these fights are linked together, and I'd say also organization is key to succeed to the success in this. Because if you want to discuss and debate these ideas for a better world, to have meetings like this where we can actually discuss it and be involved, in the day-to-day and right now in women's fights for women's equality. I'm proud to be a member of the ISO. I met these people at leafleting for a clinic defense at my university. Went to school, and they were the people who initiated that struggle. It wouldn't have happened otherwise. We all then went to Cincinnati and Buffalo and Iowa City and all sorts of places where Operation Rescue was attacking them, and we fought them back. And I thought and argued with people in groups that like Now and NARAL about why they should be taking part in that. And I think these were important fights. You know, somebody I know who's in the ISO who had to be convinced that abortion was every woman's right, and was convinced thoroughly, and became, you know, somebody who's like took a licking on a picket line against, you know, or against Operation Rescue. And I feel like those are the important struggles that we're involved in now. And, you know, to be a couple weeks ago, to be in Chicago, standing with Chicago teachers, clogging the streets of Chicago, all in our red shirts, most of them women, many of them African American women, standing and saying, you know, we are you Rahm Emanuel, we're taking you on, and we're going to beat you. And that's, you know, you get the feeling of what workers' power and fighting for women's rights. Hey, you know, if you want to fight for equal pay, trade unions that fight for women's pay, like in the teachers' union, if teachers get a raise, other people get a raise too. And I feel like these are important. These are the struggles we're involved in. But it's also about an eye to a society where true freedom is actually possible, building for that future, which I know is possible, and is worth fighting for.